Hello and welcome to In Progress. My name is Raymond Perez. So, I want to do something that is not a tradition yet, but will be a tradition on this show, and it is looking at the news. Of course, you may be wondering why this is new on the show. However, it's not today's news, or even this week's news, or even this month's news. It's last year's news put inside this year, kind of. Not really. But basically, you may know the great publications like Watch Mojo and BuzzFeed, and they primarily, do these like top 10 lists. So I'm going to do my own top 10 list of the most recent events in the United States. So without any further ado, let's get into this. Okay, so why the top 10 events? How am I doing this top 10? What is it about? Basically, I don't have any real criteria. I was thinking about maybe doing criteria like the best events of the year, but that's a bit silly. Doing criteria like the most important events of the year, which I think is what this is more, the most important events of the year, but from my perspective. So I'm not saying this is the obviously, clearly most important thing that happened this year, but I'm also not going to just talk about like gifted education, which is my primary research subject, which by the way had a lot of movement this year, not just in New York City, but around the country. There was a lot of discussion of education policy. However, I'm not going to just look at it from my perspective. So instead, just the top 10 events from the best of my knowledge about based on importance. Okay, so number 10 is one that might be a little bit shocking, actually, given the fact that criminal justice wasn't really a huge part of the year. It was much more pronounced in 2020, of course, with the protests in Minneapolis and around the country. However, it's kind of important to note that the conviction of Derek Chauvin was extremely important for the Black Lives Matter movement. And in some sense, it actually might be considered a vindication of liberal criminal justice reform, rather than these other competing ways to reform the criminal justice system. For instance, the left, and by the left I kind of mean the hard left, the DSA left, depending on what you're saying, they pushed the defund movement, defund the police. So that seemed to not really take off as much as the liberal ideas of criminal justice, such as trying to fix the system in other ways. This is not particularly any systemic change, and in fact, I would argue that criminal justice was stalled, in fact, at least legislatively. But I think there is still some progress being made, and as we like to say on the show, the change we see is always in progress. So, criminal justice, number 10, not hugely important this year, but important nonetheless. So we made a few, we made a little bit of progress there. So number 9 is, of course, more important. So progressives. So basically, this year, to me, has had a sort of theme of progressives losing quite a bit. So I'm going to take you back to December. No, actually, let's go back a bit further to April 2020, when Bernie Sanders dropped out. So actually, February 2020, before Bernie Sanders dropped out, with a massive movement behind him. In fact, the one that defeated basically every other candidate in Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada, of course, putting aside state delegate equivalents in the first contest. Now, basically, the Bernie Sanders movement had a lot of energy behind it in 2020, and the left had a lot of energy behind it in 2020, based on, you can see the Bernie Biden task force, you can see the criminal justice movement, as we discussed in the last event. There's a lot of different things that occurred in 2020 that gave a lot of wind into the progressive movement. But it seems as if this year it sort of receded quite a bit. If you look at Eric Adams defeating Maya Wiley and Catherine Garcia, who were not, well, Maya Wiley was a progressive, but Catherine Garcia was less so. She was more what I would consider almost like a PMC character, someone who is like New York Times liberal, but not like mainstream liberal. So it's kind of different there. But basically, Eric Adams won the New York City primary by running against progressivism in a very real way. And you kind of saw something similar with Shontel Brown, who was basically an unknown nationally, defeat Nina Turner, who was the Sanders, not press secretary, I think she was campaign chair for Sanders in 2020. And perhaps she also was a surrogate in 2016. I don't particularly remember her exact position in the campaign, but she was very well known. She had a lot of money behind her. I think Nina Turner actually outspent Shontel Brown, despite the massive push near the end to elect Shontel Brown from various interest groups. However, Turner spent more. I think we actually had a segment on this, although it's not on the YouTube. It's on the podcast, wherever I did the podcast before, Spotify, Google Podcasts, etc. It was a defeat for Nina Turner. So I think you can say progressives basically did not have a good year. And then finally, the last one that I'll bring up is India Walton versus Byron Brown. India Walton actually defeated Byron Brown in the Democratic primary, but she lost by, I think, a wide margin, actually, in the general election. Byron Brown was the incumbent mayor. India Walton was a socialist. And Byron Brown was defeated in the primary, as I mentioned, and via a write-in campaign, which is extremely difficult to run. The last one I can remember that was victorious was Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. Byron Brown was able to run a campaign effectively and defeat India Walton, who ran as a Democrat, but eventually lost to Byron Brown, who ran as a write-in. So that was, let's say, not great for the progressive movement. It perhaps could have gone better this year. And that's really the point with this. Okay, so number 8 is antitrust. So we have a huge movement for antitrust right now. And that is good, actually. So here we have Pete Buttigieg, I believe that is Pete Buttigieg being Secretary of Transportation. Lena Khan, who is, what is she? Chair of the FTC. Xavier Becerra, who is chair of HHS and Secretary of HHS, and Gina Raimondo, of course, Secretary of Commerce, and Merrick Garland, Attorney General. So they're all behind President Biden as he signs his anti-competition executive order. So basically, this year we saw a massive movement in favor of antitrust, not only on the left, but also on the right. Of course, you can argue about what the right really believes in terms of antitrust and whether their antitrust movements are just against woke corporations, as Marco Rubio or Josh Hawley would say, or against big tech. But it seems to me that the left is really moving on antitrust in a big way, and Biden is doing his economic populism in that sense. So antitrust is gaining a lot of steam. I think we need to look at the FTC over the next year and see what their movements are against Amazon, against Twitter, against Facebook, against these very large companies, and we need to see how that shapes up in the next year. So antitrust was big in 2021. I expect it to also be big in 22. Moving on to the border crisis. So this one I picked the event of Kamala Harris saying "do not come," which led to some memes online, but Kamala Harris and the Biden administration more generally have had to take a more, I don't want to say draconian, because it's not the Trump policy, but a much stricter stance on immigration, especially much stricter than I would like. So I understand why they're doing it. A lot of it really does come down to, number one, the Supreme Court forced them to implement the Remain in Mexico policy, the one that Trump had done himself, which basically stipulates that you have to apply for asylum in the first country you enter, which in most cases is Mexico, if you're moving in from Central America, which is where most of our immigrants come from in terms of refugees. So the border crisis is flaming. Remember the Haitian migrants that were whipped at the border in I believe Rio Grande, around the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is not a city. It's a river. And basically, the border crisis has really contributed to the falling Biden approval rating but it seems mostly to be an issue on the right, which is very difficult for Biden to win anyway. So perhaps it may not be as important next year, but I definitely expect some type of caravan in 2022 that convinces Republicans to come out and vote for the GOP, and then the caravan just dissipates, I guess, in the next week after November. So we'll see what happens with the border crisis, the so-called border crisis, and I think it will be kind of important in the next year as well. Let's move on to number 6, which is Striketober. So there was a very big movement for labor, and I mentioned in number 9 that the progressives did not have many wins this year. But I also separate progressive as a movement from the labor movement, because those are two separate movements. In fact, labor tends to actually support establishment Democrats for a variety of reasons. But you have the United Auto Workers that went on strike in this so-called Striketober, and they had I put John Deere wins. I should have put John Deere workers win. But regardless, John Deere workers went on strike in October, and I believe they got a contract in November, the 17th of November, if my memory serves me correctly. And there was quite a bit of movement regarding strikes this year. A lot of progressives pushed a general strike, which of course is not something that will happen in the United States. But regardless, there was a lot of strikes this year, a lot of not wildcat strikes, because that's not what that word means, but strikes that had no, that were not connected really in any way, other than the fact that they occurred at the same time. A quick look at the strikes that occurred this year. You had strikes from the IATSE, which you may remember some people blamed for the Russ shooting in October. The Nabisco strike, the strikes in different hospitals, primarily not due to the vaccine mandates, as a lot of people had said. The Kellogg strike, which was really big, I think it just recently ended, even December 21st it ended. John Deere, as we mentioned, healthcare, as we mentioned, McDonald's strikes in 10 cities, and the graduate students in Columbia and Harvard also went on strike. There were also some other big movements in terms of labor rights. Amazon won that Alabama unionization drive. However, we also have to remember that the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, eventually came back and said, hey, you kind of, cheated. So maybe don't do that next time. And a next time seems to occur. However, I'd be a bit skeptical that Alabama unionizes anyway, or that specific workshop unionizes. So that was 6. Let's move on to 5, which is inflation. So you can see number 5 being inflation means that there's probably a lot more stories as well. However, the important part is that I don't really see inflation as a huge deal. So I didn't put it at number 2 or even 3. So inflation, to me, seems to be transitory. Of course, to Jerome Powell, it is not transitory, although that was widely reported, but that's not really what he means. If you want more information on that, I have a video on here talking about Biden inflation and why it's not real. In that, I compare the TIPS Treasuries bond spread, and I show you why inflation will probably not be higher than 3% over the next few years. However, it was high this year. I understand that, and as a result, it's kind of important. Also, it seems like this will probably contribute to the loss in the midterms for Joe Biden. People are very scared of inflation for whatever reason, even though inflation tends to be better for debtors, which is what most Americans are. People are scared of inflation because prices and wages are both sticky, but wages are a little bit more sticky, so prices may rise faster than wages, and that can be a very big issue for a family living paycheck to paycheck. Although paycheck to paycheck does not really mean what people think it means, because, anyway, let's not get into that. And instead, let's push off the inflation point into another day, and let's just move on. Inflation at number 5, and it's high, but it's not that huge of a deal. Number 4. So I kind of debated what to put for number 4, but I think I should put the major Biden legislative agenda, which was infrastructure. So this year was dominated legislatively by infrastructure talks. A lot of people mentioned that COVID would be a major issue in the Biden administration, and it was, of course. But infrastructure, I think, was the bigger deal. Because as Biden said, he wanted to build back better, right? Although the Build Back Better bill seems to have failed, although I don't really expect it to fail that much. And I think actually it would be very shocking to me if the Biden social agenda was completely shuttered. That would just be insane, right? That would put Biden as a not good president. I'll just say that now. If Biden cannot get something socially passed, like in terms of pre-K, in terms of community college, if he can't get any of that passed, yeah, he goes down in history as an extremely lackluster president. But if he gets something like that passed, and also, to be very clear, I'm going to discuss this at a later point, probably in January 20th when I do the Biden grading. However, I should mention that I'm not going to grade Biden on a curve, right? He has Manchin and Sinema, but he knew he would have Manchin and Sinema when he got elected, and that's not really, that sucks, but like, it's his job to negotiate with them. So I'm not going to say, oh, well, Manchin is too difficult, Sinema's too difficult. Yeah, okay, that's fine, but you're not going to get extra points for that, right? It's like going in sick to a test. Okay, sure, you went in sick, but you're still getting an F, right? So that's like something quite important. And the infrastructure bill that passed wasn't actually bad anyway. I thought it was good. A lot of people were very annoyed by it, but I think bipartisan infrastructure was like the major important point of Biden at some point. I think actually that was a Trump agenda in 2018. However, he ended up failing because Trump is a failure, and Biden got that passed. So I think it's good either way, really. But whether Biden or Trump did it, but Biden got it done. So just like actually the next story, which is Afghanistan. Thank God it was Afghanistan, because I think I changed this last second. So Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, dominated coverage in August. So Operation Allies Refuge, which is I think the operational name of it, was a success in the sense that, we left Afghanistan, but the media coverage kind of portrayed it as a failure, and you could definitely argue that there were quite a few tactical failures, although the question there would be whose fault is that, and to me I wouldn't really blame that on Biden. Biden, I think, had given the call for a withdrawal much earlier, and he basically said that, we're withdrawing come hell or high water, and of course hell and high water both came. Maybe not high water because it's Afghanistan, but definitely hell was raised, and it was not very good for Biden, at least domestically. So that was a pretty big issue, of course. And although I don't expect Afghanistan to be particularly important in domestic affairs, I do expect it to be quite important in foreign affairs. But domestically, the big problem with what happened in Afghanistan was the complete and utter collapse of the Biden approval rating, which we will discuss later. But it seems to me that it began with Delta, really, but it sped up and took a major hit from the perceived failure in Afghanistan, and especially in Kabul. So that is number 3. And number 2 is the vaccine rollout. So the vaccine rollout, I'm going to not spend too much time on it because vaccines get your channel deranked on YouTube. However, I will say that Pfizer-BioNTech being fully approved was pretty important. The vaccines kind of came out in 2020, but were more widely spread in 2021. I think I would have put vaccine rollouts as number 1 had the vaccine been extremely, extremely effective. Had they been something that provided, what is it called? Total immunity. There's a T word that I can't think of, but like that type of immunity. However, it doesn't. And with the new variants that are able to pass the vaccines more effectively, like Omicron and Delta at the beginning, I don't really think you can put vaccine rollouts as number 1. Had they stopped the virus, as they had done, actually, in like June or July, I would say sure. However, they don't. So, I don't think you can put them as number 1. Let's instead move on to the honorable mentions, which here are very briefly, the COVID stimulus, the American Rescue Plan. I think that the stimulus was extremely important at the beginning of the year, but Biden didn't get too much credit for it, so it kind of like went by the wayside. The $2,000 checks were quite important. The child tax credit was quite important, but doesn't seem like that's going to be politically relevant in the next year. Next, we have the ransomware issue with the shutdown of Colonial Pipeline. That was a big issue at one point, kind of went away. We don't really know what's going on with that, so not particularly politically relevant into the next year. Abortion. This kind of traded off with number 10. The reason why I traded off is because I expect abortion to be much bigger next year due to things that happened this year, but I don't think abortion really had a huge impact in this year's politics. Maybe with actually the California runoff, which I didn't think about until right now, abortion, like the fact that Texas passed the heartbeat bill, allowed Gavin Newsom to have a much stronger case against a Republican governor, but that's questionable anyway. I feel like he would have won regardless. Let me turn off my camera, move on to the PowerPoint. Okay, so next is Biden's approval rating, which seems to be falling, and that's kind of evidenced by Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, winning in Virginia by around 3 points in a state that President Biden won by 10 points in 2020. So that's a major shift. And Phil Murphy barely holding on by about 1 point even in the New Jersey election, which I think was a swing of around 15. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was a huge swing. So we can see a major swing happening, and that does not bode well for Biden in 2022, which is what we're looking at. Why that occurred is kind of beyond my pay grade. I don't really know why that would occur. Some people blame education and critical race theory and the vaccine mandate, and I kind of doubt that. People tend not to vote based on those types of cultural issues in terms of like independence. However, I would probably say that education may have counted in terms of school lockdowns. That was a big issue that I don't think the Democrats had a real solution on. So that's a big deal. The next one is the gas prices. So gas prices going up, I don't think that's going to have much relevance next year. And the reason why is because gas prices are going to go down. They're going to go back down. And that's kind of huge. And if they do go back down, which it seems extremely likely, I don't see that playing a huge role in 2022. So the Strategic Petroleum Reserve being released, I believe in November of this year, late November, I think that can have some impact on gas prices, but as we saw with that one DCCC tweet, it's not going to be too large. So yeah, the Petroleum Reserve and gas prices, another honorable mention. And finally, the radicalization of the GOP. I would have done more on this. This would probably have been extremely high on my ranking had number 1 not been obvious. And number 1, by the way, to me wasn't obvious at the beginning, as I mentioned in the last segment. Number 2, being vaccine rollout, would probably have been number 1, depending on what happened with the vaccines. But this year, Marjorie Taylor Greene being stripped of her committees in February 2021 does not bode well for the future of the GOP in terms of being sane. It seems like they won't be sane. So the radicalization of the GOP seems to be not great. The other thing about that, however, is that the GOP does not seem to be extremely radical. It's not. Marjorie Taylor Greene has a very strong base behind her, right? But it's not the majority of the Republicans who love Marjorie Taylor Greene. Instead, I think a lot of Republicans support someone like someone a little bit more moderate than your Marjorie Taylor Greene. So with that, the final one is number 1, of course, would be January 6th, which just passed, I believe, in terms of the anniversary. The Trumpist insurrection in D.C., and it was an insurrection, even though it wasn't ever going to succeed. To me, January 6th means a lot of different things. It can mean and we're going to put this back on, it can mean what eventually occurred, right, the riot, but more importantly, it means quite a bit in terms of the efforts by Trump to steal the election, right? Which I kind of associate more with 2020, but we can talk about it in 2021. You have, for instance, the January 3rd phone. Well, the phone call wasn't on January 3rd, but it was leaked on January 3rd of Trump calling Brad Raffensperger in Georgia and asking for his 11,000 votes. Forget the exact number. So that movement, the movement to overthrow the duly elected government, and that's what it would be at that time. That was dangerous, extremely dangerous, and to me, it seems it's going to hold the most staying power of basically any story in the first year of the Biden administration. So even if people don't vote on it, which of course people don't vote on things like this, it will be a warning sign for 24 and even for 22. So this to me seems to be the most important story of 2021. 50 years from now, we will remember 2021 for January 6th. And even with the vaccines, even with COVID, it seems to me that January 6th will be the number one thing that we remember from 2021 going on into the future. So with that, that's basically all I have for you today. 10 stories that shook the United States and, or maybe didn't shake them that much, like the first few, but 10 stories that shook the United States. Something that is kind of important here. I didn't include things like the Rittenhouse trial, the Arbery trial. I guess I kind of included that in the beginning, but I tried to stay away from the culture war because to me the culture war is kind of fleeting. I can't remember anything major that happened in the culture war over the last year. Cancun cruise was kind of big, I guess, at some point. But it seems to me that this doesn't have that much staying power and also not much institutional importance, which is what this show primarily looks at. So with that, remember that the change we need to see is always in progress, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.